Hello again, everybody, and welcome to today's first keynote session at the Psychology of Global Crises conference. My name is Niklas Chimirri. I work at Roskilde University in Denmark, and I have the pleasure of introducing our upcoming keynote speaker to you, Ines Langemeyer from the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology, Germany. I met Ines around 15 years ago when I was a student of psychology at the Free University of Berlin. Here, Ines taught an incredibly inspirational course on media reception and cultural studies from a subject scientific perspective. I'm still very grateful to her for having introduced me into media psychology that went beyond mere cause and effect thinking. Media psychology that craved situating people's media reception in a concrete technological and cultural, thus societal and historical reality of those we seek to develop knowledge together with, from within everyday life. Ines has since moved on to become professor in teaching learning relations research in Karlsruhe, while returning her strong interest in exploring the many roles digital and other modern technology plays in mediating and developing knowledge. Her research investigates what the scientification of work and of thinking more generally applies for enculturation and other daily learning practices, how epistemic cultures in higher and other adult education are shaped thereby, what possibilities and limitations competence and attention theories offer for understanding cooperation, what role collective experiencing and transformative agency play in these processes, or in a nutshell, how to draw on and develop cultural, historical, and critical psychological theorizing, as well as Bertolt Brecht's epic theater and Kurt Lewine's field theory, in order to better understand and learn in our digitalized, crisis-ridden world. Accordingly, learning is also at the heart of her upcoming talk, which Ines entitled Learning in Face of a Crisis, and I much look forward to discussing with you and her in a live Q&A on Zoom right after the talk has been screened. But now to you, Ines. The virtual floor is yours.
Welcome everyone to this conference and this keynote. I'm going to talk about learning in face of a crisis. Can we learn in face of a crisis? And what should we learn? To be urged to learn in face of a critical situation, in face of a danger, is probably not what we would consider as an adequate situation for learning. A normal psychic response in face of hazard is not learning, but the activation of the body for flight to escape the menacing situation. But today, there is no possibility to escape. This is one aspect of a global crisis. It is encompassing in dimensions of space and time. Another aspect is that global crises do not occur as single events that simply pass by. They co-occur with many other crises in the world. Today, the pandemic triggers and reinforces other global crises, such as unemployment, inequality, violence against children and women, the femicide, the refugee crisis, and since political fight against these problems is understood according to the capitalist nation-state, national governments strive to regain economic strength. They respond to the pandemic by boosting the economy, which will thus reinforce the climate change and the extinction of species. We've got the taste of global crisis now, as being similar to the ancient Hydra, the snake-like monster. After decapitating one of its heads, it regenerates two new ones. What did we learn so far? Or at best, what can we say that we have learned? In some parts, it was remarkable in Germany how the public was informed about the uncertainties and the difficulties to cope with a largely unknown virus infection. However, all this was and still is for many people a disturbing experience. In Germany, we witness these days the formation of new popular protest against the restrictions. And surprisingly, these protests unite individuals with very different concerns. Some support the anti-immunization lobby, some believe in conspiracy theories, which deny, among others, the man-made climate change. Others are followers of extreme right-wing parties. And there are also left-wing activists protesting for civil rights. What we may witness here is the emergence of a new front line against politics, against the existing form of democracy. In the pandemic, this generalized mistrust in politics continues and includes nowadays the scientists and science in general. Many people are stirred up by conspiracy theories that are easily available through the internet. With regard to this front line, it is evident that new hegemonic forces might gain power that are not at all favorable to learning in face of a crisis. But what should we learn? And what is the particularity of this learning? My concern regarding these questions is first to form a clearer idea about emancipatory developments that could emerge in an exceptional situation. Second, my concern is that those who stand up against the detrimental effects of global crisis nowadays are not learning in an emancipatory way. Let me explain some theoretical thoughts to develop a deeper understanding of learning in an emancipatory way. In their book on globalization and organization, Gilly Drory and John Mayer pointed out that globalization is driven by a certain scientization of our way of life. Furthermore, globalization has a culture of actorhood and empowerment. By culture of actorhood and empowerment, they mean the ways in which individuals or groups are societally formed as legitimate actors. And this cultural process would be carried by the rapidly expanding and globalized educational institutions. So here we are looking now at the problem of how learning is organized in a global culture. Learning in face of a crisis must therefore start with an analysis of these features. The ambivalent role of science in the world and how intervention into the different hegemonic cultures of actorhood is possible. By combining these two questions, we start to practice critical science. Critical science is about thinking in relation to expanding possibilities to act, to realize values such as emancipation, peace, and freedom in the world. Critical science is analyzing why possibilities to realize this are foreclosed. Therefore, a fourth concern of mine about learning is captured in the current topic of the Anthropocene, a term coined by Paul Crutzen. It addresses that there are many man-made changes of the world, beginning with the use of fossil energies that serve industrialized methods of production, logistics, and technologies of mobility, and that encompass also the production of huge amounts of CO2 and the masses of non-decomposing waste, such as plastic. All these man-made changes accumulate to long-term effects on the entire geological conditions. The climate, the ecosystems worldwide, the soil layers, the oceans, etc. As the Anthropocene concept emphasizes, the long-term effects of these industrialized forms of life are fundamental issues. The Anthropocene perspective can thus be summarized as an essential insight into temporality. Individual human development and regeneration have a different time logic compared to societal systems development and regeneration. Furthermore, the Anthropocene perspective clarifies that the evolution and the regeneration of ecosystems take, as a rule, an amount of time which exceeds by multiple the reproduction cycles of individual lives. Against this background, I now return to the question of learning. Learning belongs to the individual development, but it can also belong to cultural and political developments. Learning in face of a crisis needs to exceed the boundaries of individual concerns, especially because of the distorted manner in which individual concerns are nowadays preformed. There is a powerful contradiction in the way economic interests of the individual are societally set and the way ecological interests are set. Economic interests are short-term interests. If people's lives are threatened economically, they are immediately losing essential parts of their way of existence. Ecological concerns are long-term concerns, but it is not immediately and precisely predictable when which detrimental effect will occur and destroy whose lives. Learning in face of a crisis has to consider the different temporality of causes and effects, depending on whether they stem from globalized socio-economic systems or from global ecosystems. However, learning as we know it, the concrete forms in which learning or education is societally organized, are mainly oriented towards the requirements of educational systems. The past decades, many political institutions like the OECD, for example, claimed that the educational systems should meet the demands of the labor market. Especially in relation to the digitalization movement, the visions about how we should learn in the future merged into this message. People should be ready to learn anytime, anywhere, and anything, if it serves the purpose of the labor market. The main problem is that according to this vision, learning is or becomes distorted and restricted. Let me explain why I think so. Referring to the framework of German Scandinavian critical psychology, learning comprises in general the striving of individuals to gain influence and power over those conditions that are relevant to the reproduction of their existence. Learning is thus not an activity dependent on teaching only. Teaching is important, but nevertheless, it is primarily an activity related to individuals' existential interests to participate in societal life and to dispose of the relevant preconditions of one's conduct of life. Therefore, learning is motivated activity if it is not distorted by certain constraints. The vision of learning that I try to depict here is, of course, a utopian perspective. But this is useful in an analytical sense. This refers to the approach of the critical psychologist Klaus Holzkamp, who emphasized that learning is potentially something that overcomes restricted forms of agency. Overcoming restricted forms of agency means to solve problems more fundamentally. The solution is not just a way of modeling through or a kind of superficial management. It tries to resolve contradictions and to abolish constraints, and is therefore an attempt to gain a form of generalized agency or generalized capacity to act. Again, these ideas are in some ways utopian and thus must be understood as analytic. To distinguish restricted and generalized forms of agency means using analytic concepts. And I will explain these analytic concepts a bit more. Restricted capacity to act refers to human suffering or generally any injury, including anxiety, which contributes to the quality of being exposed to and dependent upon other directed circumstances, dissociated from possibilities to controlling essential long-term conditions. That means constraints on possibilities to act. In contradistinction, generalized capacity to act implies real improvement in the subjective quality of my life and is synonymous with enhanced influence over my objective life conditions. That is, with my opportunities for forming alliances, that means uniting with others. This is how Holzkamp wrote about it. Following Holzkamp, an analytic approach to human action and agency is relevant for understanding learning, potentially as a form of striving for generalized capacity to act. But since there are many societal contradictions, learning is also distorted, driven by societal pressures, so that it is merely a way of getting along with demands that the learner rather wants to repel. Distortions of learning can also be explained by the fact that learning is realized in rather isolated forms, so that the relevance of the matter cannot be recognized and explored by the learner. Societal contexts that make problems visible and allow investigations for getting a deeper insight into the problematic are therefore paramount. Learning, for example, in privacy by using a webinar that presents pieces of information as knowledge, that means as unproblematic units of knowledge, are consequently restricted opportunities to learn. Our ways of knowing thus develops unconnected to collectivized forms of learning, without connections to the societal horizon of global crisis, including the deeper understanding of what a particular crisis is about and how intervention could be organized. Paying attention to time logic is also important in this context. The ecological crisis calls for protection of nature against the world economy, against its exploitation and its destruction due to economic interests. People need to learn about the trade-offs between seeing nature as a limitless resource, allegedly free to exploit, and nature as a common ground for all species. The learning would be about bringing together the insights of natural sciences concerning the long-term reproduction cycles of natural resource regeneration and insights about societal reproduction. To bring the two perspectives together, the quality of learning needs to be acknowledged as transformative. The crisis of the pandemic and the climate catastrophe are, in my eyes, renewing and underscoring this insight. We recognize that the global economic system is fragile because many parts of this system cannot function in the same way as before. And since some parts of the system were shut down, others are difficult to restart. The interdependence of all parts of the global system is the reason why the whole complex is volatile. However, these economic effects bring about the necessity of trade-offs with ecological and societal effects. We should therefore pay attention to the quality of learning in the education systems, as well as in the labor market. If learning skills shrivel because people only got used to consume instant learning nibbles, the cultural disaster of not learning in face of a crisis will augment the global suffering and the global destruction. Many transformations of societal relations are needed, and they are not ready at hand. They emerge in trade-offs, and learning is essential for sustainable solutions. These lessons to learn are not developed by pedagogues. They emerge when we act and intervene and reflect these experiences together with regard to a common goal. Maybe this is already the most difficult insight to learn in face of a crisis. Thank you for your attention.